thanks Jen, and first I'd like to just say thank you for having me today. It's such a thrill to be here presenting with other folks who've also been working in Whiskeytown National Recreation Area. And I'd also like to just quickly acknowledge that this is not a solo effort, and I'm working with Joe Fontaine and Neil Enright down in Western Australia, as well as my advisor Brian Harvey on this research. So I think the last couple of talks have probably convinced you that fire activity is a pretty big deal in our ecosystems here in California and around the world. Fire activity is increasing in many areas, or certainly changing, and there is a big standing question about how plants are going to respond to this changing fire activity. And one really important piece to think about when we're thinking about plant response is this idea of plant traits. And so plants have many different strategies for dealing with fire activity. So one of those is fire-resistant bark. In species like ponderosa pine, they employ it to be able to survive fires. Other species, particularly in the chaparral ecosystems, are resprouters, so they come back vegetatively from buds. But there are other species that don't try to survive fires at all, and they employ serotinous cones to regenerate post-fire. So this is, as Jen mentioned, my focus, and a little bit more about how serotinous cones work. They accumulate on a plant over many, many years, keeping those cones sealed up tight on the plant before being released with heat from fire. So the resinous bonds are broken, seeds are dispersed, and we end up with something that looks kind of like this. It's a carpet of seedlings, and the traditional idea of how this plant trait worked is that plants invested all of their resources into regenerating after fire and not surviving it. So this means that this trait is probably most common in high-severity stand-replacing fire regimes. As you can see here in this bottom picture, there are no survivors from the previous cohort. And so historically, this was a great mechanism of resilience in these high-severity systems. Take this young stand would grow up into the mature stand you see at the top left. You can see many cones along the boles, perhaps, of those trees. And then eventually another stand replacing fire would occur, and the cycle would continue like that. But we're starting to potentially see more fire activity in these young stands. And as you might know, it takes a lot of time to accumulate cones and seeds on plants. So these young trees are not yet reproductively mature. So increasing fire activity, we'll probably start seeing a lot more of these young forests starting to burn in various areas. And the term type conversion has been mentioned a couple of times this morning. That's very likely what would happen if these trees don't have cones in place at the time of fire. We'd likely see something like a transition to a shrub-dominated or grass-dominated ecosystem. And then the cycle would continue in perpetuity, because these species typically do not have very much long-distance seed dispersal. They tend to disperse right after fire on the site. So, there are a few other terms used for this that I might use during the presentation. Immaturity risk or interval squeeze are used in the literature. And so we were really interested in studying this phenomenon in knobcone pine forests for a couple of reasons. First of which is that knobcone pine, throughout most of its range, is highly serotinous. So it tends to hold onto its cones for a very long time in the absence of fire. And also, this is a precocious cone producer, so they tend to produce cones by 5 or 6 years, or they can produce them that young, which is much earlier than many of our other coniferous species here in the western United States. And then finally, these forests have experienced quite a bit of fire activity since we've been recording fire activity. On the left here, there's a fire map using MTBS data, or monitoring trends and burn severity data, in the distribution of knobcone pine, which is in blue, and then red shows anywhere that's burned since 1984. So fire is a component in these ecosystems. And we got in touch with Jen and Agne back in 2018 to just study knobcone pine, young knobcone pine, and how cone production happens over time in these stands. So they had some young knobcone pine in Whiskeytown. We went and counted cones, characterized the stands, and about a month later, the Carr Fire happened. So this event, as we've heard a lot about, was a very big deal in the area, but also provided a really interesting opportunity for us as ecologists to compare pre-fire data to what happened after the fire burned through. And so we returned, and our research questions for this component of my research are first simply, how did the knobcone pine stand density change from pre-fire to post-fire? Second, we compared two different fire ages that we had sampled before the Carr Fire. So in 2018, before the Carr Fire, we sampled in the 2008 motion fire, so stands that were about on a 10-year fire interval, and then within the 2004 power tower fire in perimeter, so those were 14-year interval. So we were interested to see if that extra 4 years on the interval had any difference for the post-fire regeneration of the species. And then finally, since we had this pre-fire cone information, we were interested in relating the pre-fire cone abundance specifically to the regeneration. Theoretically, more cones should give you more post-fire regeneration, and we were interested in testing that. So quickly, what we did in May 2019, we returned to resample our plots that we had measured the year before. Our pre-fire measurements included an overstory stand census and cone counts, in addition to some other information that I won't really be discussing today, but we did characterize the fuels and the understory plants as well. And then post-fire, we went back and counted knobcone pine regeneration and within a subset of the plot. And in some cases, regeneration densities were so low that we did expand to cover the full plot so that we had that overlap of the same plot size as the pre-fire stand. And we did this in a total of 18 plots in those two different fire ages. So getting straight into our results, first question is, how did density change post-fire? So here we have pre-fire density on the x-axis for the overstory stand before the Carr Fire. On the y-axis, we have post-fire regeneration density, and then I have the range and medians there for reference as well. Each dot represents one of our plots, and then this diagonal line is the line of self-replacement. So any points that fall above that line increased in density post-fire, and any points below decreased in density post-fire. So the first thing to point out is that there was no evidence at all of regeneration failure, meaning that where there was knobcone pine before the fire, we saw no knobcone pine after the fire. So no zeros. But we can see that most of these dots do fall below that 1-to-1 line, so we only saw an increase in stand density in 33%, 1/3 of the stands. And just to point out too, we're comparing mature or 10 to 14-year-old trees to first-year seedlings, so we can expect that a lot of those seedlings will probably die just through normal attrition. So these are very low numbers. If the goal were to have the same pre-fire density perpetuated through time, we don't really expect to see that. And I should mention too that most of the seed dispersal, since it's fire-cued release, does happen in that first year post-fire, so we're not really expecting to see much additional regeneration for this species. So we really do expect that these densities are going to decrease, if anything. And just to put that another way, this is the same graph except for we have the ratio of regeneration density to pre-fire density on the y-axis. And so you can see that that ratio ranged from about 25% of the pre-fire density to about 4 times the pre-fire density. And we saw self-replacement most often in the low-density stands, which makes sense because the threshold to reach self-replacement is much lower. So was there a difference between these two intervals? This is, again, we have the 2 different ages, the 10-year-old and the 14-year-old stands that burned in the Carr Fire against post-fire regeneration density. You can see that that extra 4 years of an interval didn't make much of a difference in terms of the regeneration. But to compare, we did have one single site that we measured that was an older site that had no recent fire activity that we were aware of in at least the last 30 years. And the regeneration in that was much higher. And I don't want to make too much of this because it's a single point and could be an outlier. We can't really say anything statistically, but this is what we would, more of the ballpark of the regeneration we would expect in an older stand that was burning on sort of a more closer to the historical fire regime, or what we think the historical fire regime in these type of knobcone pine stands would have been. So finally, taking a look at this cone data, we have here the pre-fire average cones per tree on the x-axis. So at a stand level, what was the average number of cones on a tree when those stands burned, against post-fire regeneration density. And you can kind of see that there isn't a strong pattern, not as strong as I would have expected. So I think that it's probably a little bit more complicated than saying from this many cones you can expect this many seedlings. But I did notice that there was this possible threshold at 3 cones per tree on average, which I thought was kind of interesting and something I'm planning to maybe look into a little bit more with some more data. I think that if we can identify this relationship between cones and regeneration, it might be a really useful tool for managers at some point down the line. So stay tuned on that. And I haven't really mentioned, but I'm sort of seeing this as a pilot data set. We're planning to do some more sampling this next year, 2 years post-Carr Fire, both to revisit the seedlings that we measured this last year and increase our sample size. So we're really interested in understanding how seedling attrition is affecting those regeneration densities across the landscape in Whiskeytown. And we are interested to see if maybe there is some protracted recruitment, if there are additional seedlings coming in. We don't think that there should be, but we'd like to take a look and see if there could be an additional seed source coming in after the fact. And then finally, we're hoping to expand this into a couple of other 2018 fires that burned through knobcone. It would be really interesting to know exactly how short that fire interval would need to be before we see knobcone pine not recruiting at all. 10 years, we're still seeing some regeneration, even though it's decreasing on average. That's not short enough to be able to burn those trees and remove them from the landscape completely. So it'd be interesting to see in the Mendocino complex, for example, there are some areas where it burned on a 6-year interval, whether that's short enough to do this immaturity risk phenomenon that we're interested in. So just to wrap up, reiterate that we did see regeneration everywhere that there was knobcone pine before the fire, but on average we saw decreased densities, and we think that these densities are likely to decline even more in the future. So even though this short interval that we think is shorter than the historical fire return interval would have been, we think that there's a likelihood that these stands are going to change, even though there is some knobcone there. We may see stands in the future that are lower density, or some of these areas, the seedlings may experience mortality levels that wipe it out completely from these sites. But the bottom line is that it's a little bit difficult to make grand statements about the future of these stands after 1 year monitoring, and we're very interested to see what happens the next couple of years with these stands. And with that, I'll just acknowledge my funders and my partners' logistical support, and I think I have a few minutes for questions.